So, yeah, I guess before diving into the specific research findings that we had from our December report, which was called "The Light That Cannot Be Extinguished," it's on our website if you want further details. I just wanted to take a step back and provide a tiny bit of context first as to what we mean by transnational repression. So these are a range of tactics. These can be both physical or digital and more indirect tactics that governments have increasingly been using to reach across borders to silence dissent amongst diasporas and exiles. Our Freedom House has been working on this issue for over the last 5 years. We've now produced 5 research reports looking both at the global scale of the issue, and you can see the number of countries in this chart that are involved in transnational repression, and also looking at how host governments are responding to address the issue, and how also civil society and tech companies can also better respond to address the threats. And one of the specific or the key trends that has emerged from our tracking of incidents over the last few years is more specifically the targeting of journalists working and living in exile. Of course, different groups and individuals may be targeted by transnational repression, but what we find by the nature of the job of doing journalism, being critical of governments and exposing wrongdoings, they are particularly vulnerable to these threats. And we've kept a database of incidents going back to 2014. And from that database of physical incidents of transnational repression, we found that at least 26 governments have targeted journalists in 112 physical direct incidents. Now that means physical assaults, kidnappings, arrests and deportations, and even assassinations of journalists. These types of incidents only really capture a fraction of the phenomenon itself. As I mentioned, transnational repression can also include digital intimidation, can include surveillance, can also include what we call coercion by proxy, which is intimidation of family members back home. And these cases are usually harder to verify and are often underreported. So we don't put them in our database. But it's definitely a range of tactics that we wanted to better understand, and both in terms of how it impacts journalists and how it also affects the work that they do. So why did we want to look at this trend specifically now? Well, the transnational targeting of journalists intersects with another worrying global trend that we've been tracking at Freedom House over the last couple of decades, and that's the shrinking space for free and independent media around the world. And from our Freedom in the World report, and here's a little plug, but the most recent one came out today, and we have a launch event in an hour or so, so stay tuned. But we find that over a third of countries around the world, free and independent media are either absent or severely constrained. And over the past few years alone, we've seen intensifying crackdowns in countries like Nicaragua, in places like Hong Kong, Russia, which have forced more and more exiles to actually leave their countries altogether. But simply leaving a country doesn't mean that they're necessarily safe and free to do their work. And as repressive regimes increasingly clamp down on dissent within their borders, we see that transnational repression is becoming a growing problem for a growing number of journalists who are now forced to do their work outside of the country. So what we looked at to better understand the impact of these threats in our most recent research, we interviewed over a dozen exiled journalists from a range of countries, from China, from Pakistan, from Cambodia, Iran, Russia, Turkey, and now based in what are supposed to be safe havens in Europe and North America. but they continued to be targeted by their countries of origin. Um, Roughly half of those that we interviewed had some form of background in journalism before entering exile, and many experienced harassment already when working domestically. So that includes, for example, the case of Kia Baloch, who's mentioned here, who's a freelance journalist from Pakistan, and he had to relocate to Norway after being threatened by security services, and he was placed on an anti-terrorism watch list. But the threats didn't stop there. Once in Norway, he learned that he was on a list of people being accused of being involved in anti-Pakistan activities. His asylum process was also delayed as a result, and he was also advised to get a safety alarm, and his family members back home also got harassed multiple times. So the threats and challenges continued on many levels. But interestingly, some of the other journalists that we interviewed actually became journalists precisely because of the repression that they and their families faced back home. And that includes the case of Nurman Abdulrashid, for example, who joined Radio Free Asia in the hope that she would find information about her family members who were targeted by Chinese authorities back home. And so she joined Radio Free Asia, but not only has she now been disconnected from any news of her family, now she's based in the US, but she has also faced relentless online harassment and has been accused of working for the US government. So what we find from all these interviews and from talking to the journalists is that transnational repression can affect their work in both small and profound ways. At the most basic level, there's a risk of physical harm and a number of physical attacks that we've seen. You know, Russian journalists, for example, falling ill with symptoms of poisoning. Belarusian authorities forcing a commercial plane to land to detain a journalist, the Pratasevich case, a blogger from Azerbaijan in France who got repeatedly stabbed. So all of these cases create a climate of physical insecurity. But even at a more practical level, these types of threats, ongoing persecution, create everyday obstacles. So many of those that we interviewed mentioned that they often could not travel to other countries in the region for fear of being monitored, for fear of being detained and deported back home. So it really kind of constrains their movements to report in other countries. And it can also even prevent their access to basic services, for example, banking services. So for example, one Turkish journalist that we interviewed in the US had multiple of his accounts closed down, and that was likely because he faced a number of unfounded criminal accusations against him that were launched by Turkish authorities. The cost burden is also significant if you consider the number of cyber attacks that are launched against exiles' media outlets, but also little things like having to book flights and book hotel reservations at the very last minute to avoid being tracked and monitored. All of these costs accumulate and can exacerbate the financial burden of doing journalism. But on a much deeper level, what we see is that these relentless attacks, smear campaigns, and online abuse and the risk of surveillance can have a real cumulative effect on journalists' mental and emotional well-being. And they also have a chilling effect on their ability to pursue sensitive stories and communicate safely with their sources. So I'll just give a couple of illustrative examples here. Amber and Zaman, for example, she's a prominent a Turkish journalist now living in exile, and she has faced relentless smear campaigns and also ongoing criminal probes against her. And she mentioned that now many of the sources within the country don't want to talk to her, and even outside of the country. So she went so far as to say that these threats have made her radioactive. Um, and then, as Barang Tajin from BBC Persian also explains, journalists not don't just have to worry about how it impacts them personally and their own work, but they have to worry about their loved ones back home. So when family members risk getting detained or risk losing their jobs because of what what they do for work, then journalists often have to make very tough choices. In many cases, they have to cut ties with their family members, and they lose crucial networks of support, or they choose to not cover certain stories or remain anonymous. But some of these threats can also be powerful enough that journalists choose to leave their profession altogether. Now I've mentioned the direct impact of these threats, but I think it's important to mention that they also exacerbate the already challenging conditions of reporting from exile, and the previous presentations already mentioned uh, many of these challenges. I won't go into depth about it, but both in terms of lengthy immigration processes, which make journalists more vulnerable and leave them in a more precarious condition. So when threats are launched against them, they suffer from being perceived as a threat to their new host country. They also have much more limited resources to contend with digital attacks. They struggle oftentimes to reach their audiences, and they have to find new ways to overcome censorship. And also to be able to protect their sources. So these are some of the many challenges that make an already difficult job even harder when they're facing transnational threats. Now I'll end with a few of the measures or sources that support that interviewers mentioned that might help them to mitigate these threats. Um, so oftentimes journalists mention that digital hygiene practices and taking other types of precautions like not sharing personal details, assessing several risks when traveling, um, uh, can help to mitigate some of these threats. But altogether, these measures really place the burden largely on the individual to kind of assess what the threats are and to take appropriate measures to protect themselves. They also mentioned some support from host countries. So, for example, law enforcement can provide security protections, and in countries like the UK or Norway, we see law enforcement offering safety alarm watches or panic buttons to be installed in their homes in case of attacks. And journalists have also, at other levels, appealed to diplomats to advocate for their cases, especially when it concerns family members back home. But oftentimes they mention that they sort of lacked practical follow-up after instigating these contacts, and they mentioned that they that public interventions are still rare on their behalf. The last source of support is from media organizations themselves when they have enough resources, like, for example, those that are integrated within big structures like the BBC that have more resources to track these threats and alert staff to them in advance. But also civil society organizations, media advocacy organizations that can help journalists to access resources and to raise awareness about their cases and advocate on their behalf. But altogether, what we find is that these measures are all still quite ad hoc, and they're still many gaps in providing a more coordinated approach to mitigate these threats. So hopefully I'm not over time. I just see my PowerPoint here, so just talking to the
right. Well, we'll give you another minute, but if you could wrap up, that would be
okay. I'm wrapping up with my last slide, and I won't go into too much detail because transnational repression is very much a complex policy issue. It spans both domestic and foreign policy. Our website includes very detailed recommendations on addressing transnational repression and also how better support journalists who face these threats. But I'll just mention 4 kind of key priorities that both governments, tech companies, and civil society organizations should take into account. Firstly, democracies must recognize transnational repression as a distinct threat. Being able to address it and tailor responses actually requires defining what it is and recognizing the phenomenon itself. Also, social media companies can also play a part in this in terms of documenting digital tactics and publicly identifying those governments that use them. Secondly, reviewing and bolstering protections for those journalists that are targeted. I'll mention here especially the immigration processes, strengthening resettlement programs to help journalists get legal status and protection from transnational repression where they're not perceived as a threat, both in the asylum process and outside it. That's especially crucial. And thirdly, delivering accountability for acts of transnational repression, to ensure that perpetrators don't feel like they can run freely and continue these acts without consequences. So this includes diplomatic pressure, issuing targeted sanctions against perpetrators of transnational repression, like visa bans, asset freezes, things like that. And then lastly, I'll end with the importance of supporting the resiliency of exiled journalists and media outlets, both in terms of legal, financial, psychological assistance. As my previous panelists mentioned, exile is no longer a kind of temporary status. They're dealing with an uncertain future. So we really need to find support that can ensure their survival and resilience in the longer term so that journalists can continue to report on really important developments in some of the most authoritarian countries. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.